The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We told you recently the story of Episcopal minister Mark Sims, who has been charged several times for feeding homeless people in Fort Lauderdale. Some local prominent attorneys have decided that enough is enough, and they're actually fighting back, suing the city of Fort Lauderdale. Now, you might say, well, hold on a second, David. You told us last week or the week before that there are statutes in place in Fort Lauderdale which prevent this kind of mass on the street, in public, providing of food to homeless people. So aside from whether we think it's ridiculous or not, which most of you did, by the way, in response to that story, there are laws in place that prevent this. So these individuals that are doing this are factually speaking breaking the law. Well, the attorneys that have agreed to file the lawsuits against the city of Fort Lauderdale say that those statutes violate not only the U.S. Constitution, but also the Florida Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Quote from one of the attorneys, "This statute, this law in the city is unconstitutional. The entire Constitution that we learn in law school, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of association, due process, equal protection, protect Sims's actions of feeding homeless people." He went on to say it's nonsense. It's trying to restrict the feeding programs so the homeless will not gather in public and will go somewhere else so we will not see them. The homeless people are not being treated equally with the rest of the community. This is obviously what these laws are designed to do, and we've seen these in cities all around the country. And the idea is we want to get the homeless people somewhere where they are not visible. And if you start feeding homeless people out on the street, that makes them very, very visible. I don't know, as far as the legal argument here, whether this constitutional argument or whether the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in Florida argument will supersede or in any way invalidate the statutes that have been passed. Whether or not the statutes are against those provisions, one thing is clear, which is that the statutes are absolutely unethical. And this attempt that we've seen all across the country to sort of push the homeless where we don't see them, number one, is completely immoral and unethical. And number two, it's not very effective at actually reducing homelessness. And it creates a situation where you need to constantly create new laws, which has been done, and police the individuals. And this isn't good for anybody. We've actually figured out that it is cheaper to house and feed the homeless and provide them with health care than it is to let them live on the streets because of police hours that go into moving and addressing and speaking to and arresting very often for technical violations that the average individual would never be arrested for, and the social service cost, and they show up in hospitals without insurance, and they fill up space in prisons, etc., etc. This doesn't make sense. It's actually fiscally conservative to just straight up house, feed, and provide health care to the homeless. And Fort Lauderdale is trying to jail people who are simply feeding the homeless. It is truly, truly sickening. As we close in on the holiday season, I want to give you a very clear message. If you want to skip the rest of this topic, I'll give you the main point right away. The Salvation Army is effectively an anti-gay church, and you shouldn't give any money to those bell ringers with the red cans on the street that are all over the country. That's the main point. And we'll tell you more. We've talked about this before. Our friend John Becker over at the Bellerico Project has written very clearly about this. So I will quote him. Quote, John says, "The Salvation Army has a history of active discrimination against gays and lesbians. While you might think you're helping the hungry and homeless by donating to the bell ringers, you actually should not drop a few dollars in those bright red buckets because not everyone can share in the donations. Many LGBT people are rejected by the evangelical church charity because they are, quote, sexually impure." Now, if you go and look at what the Salvation Army says specifically about LGBT individuals, as John writes, you will see that they claim to hold a positive view of human sexuality. But then they go on to clarify that sexual intimacy is understood as a gift of God to be enjoyed within the context of a heterosexual marriage. Christians whose sexual orientation is primarily or exclusively same-sex are called upon to embrace celibacy as a way of life. So if you're not an active homosexual, which is an insane term that has been coined by bigots on the right for the most part, you can show up, and if they don't really know exactly what your story is, if you're not in a same-sex relationship, you can probably get benefits and shelter or food from the Salvation Army. But the reality is that if you're living who you are, if you are living a life that corresponds to who you actually are, the Salvation Army does discriminate, and there are just so many options for donations, particularly around the holidays. I choose to contribute to local organizations in New York City and in Massachusetts, the two places where I split my time. And there's just no reason to think that if you don't donate to the Salvation Army, fewer people will be helped. Your donations elsewhere will help just as many people, and it won't be only people who have passed some kind of anti-gay litmus test. So I cannot stress this enough. For many years, I have not given any money to the Salvation Army bell ringers. I encourage you not to give them any money at all. There are countless other charities. I mean, just think about Doctors Without Borders, Habitat for Humanity, to name a couple, and local shelters that do similar work as the Salvation Army, where you don't have to wonder, well, is the local Salvation Army in line with the national, or do they have different views? You can just show up and say, hey, you're a standalone shelter, you're a standalone food pantry. Tell me what your views are. Let's be very clear here. And if you want to donate, then you donate. This is what I recommend. And I can't imagine anybody could present an argument, a strong argument, that would convince me otherwise here. Last story today. A 12-year-old boy has been shot by police after grabbing what turned out to be a replica gun. He died from wounds suffered from being shot by police. Officers responded to a 911 call in Cleveland about someone waving around a gun. The caller reportedly described the gun as, quote, probably fake. This was at a playground. Deputy Chief Ed Tomba said that one officer fired twice after the boy pulled out the fake weapon. The fake weapon did not have the orange tip, indicating that it is not a real gun. Supposedly, the individual refused to put the gun down when police told him to drop it, 12-year-old boy, and started turning and arguably allegedly waving it around, and police shot him twice. The boy did not make any verbal threats. This is a complicated situation here, the killing of Tamir Rice by police. On the one hand, you would think police are trained to properly assess whether someone poses a risk. And when you see a 12-year-old boy on a playground, you might say, well, the fact that he doesn't respond in compliance in exactly the same way that an adult would should not necessarily tell us to shoot this individual. We're talking about a 12-year-old boy on a playground. At the same time, police are saying, well, he was told to drop the gun and he didn't, and he waved it around and the gun didn't have the orange safety tip. The orange safety tip thing is becoming increasingly an issue of contention, because if you are to assume that any gun, if police should be assuming as police that any gun that doesn't have an orange safety tip is a real gun and thus act accordingly with force, police should also be assuming that any gun with an orange tip is not a real gun and thus should never apply force in those situations. Unfortunately, we know of stories where real guns have had a fake orange tip painted on it. In other words, the tip, it was really an orange tip, but it was meant to imply the gun wasn't real when in fact it was. And nobody would say that, hey, listen, police, if they see the orange tip, they should never shoot. Nobody would impose that on police. We would expect police to use their professional skills to make an assessment regardless of the color of the tip of the gun. And as such, it's not unreasonable to expect police to use that same judgment, to have to make a call based on a true evaluation that stands apart from the gun not having that orange tip. Now, there will be many, and some people have already emailed me saying, David, listen, you've got a kid. Police don't know that he's 12. He's on a playground, meaning that he could be threatening other children, and the gun didn't have the orange tip. When the kid doesn't put the gun down and waves it around or acts in a way that's anything but compliant, police were absolutely right to shoot that child. And if that is your absolute position, if you're convinced of that, then I feel very sorry that that's the type of society you've ascertained that we live in. It's certainly not the type of society I would like to live in. Police are doing an investigation here. The investigation is supposedly going to look into whether the police acted appropriately. It will review the details of that phone call. What evidence was there? The caller did say the gun is probably fake. How much consideration should have been given to that? Was any consideration given to that? Were police advised by the dispatcher that the gun was reported as probably fake? A very tragic story no matter what. And we're going to follow the investigation and see what comes of it.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show membership program is made possible in part by liberalbias.com. There is a new conservative talk show in town. Check out Liberal Bias video on YouTube for all the important issues presented without all that pesky liberal bias. Liberal Bias video on YouTube. Today's new member of the day is Stephen Tompkins. Stephen Tompkins, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. You can, of course, join Stephen. Remember, we're funded mostly by individual members like Stephen Tompkins, not by big media conglomerates or big corporations. And you can become a member. Vote with your dollars, davidpakman.com/membership. Or for just a little while longer, get yourself a free 2015 David Pakman Show Patriot Mail calendar with your yearly membership at davidpakman.com/calendar15. This week in show history, 3 years ago, Goldline executives were charged with fraud, and I outlined a previous investigation we did that resulted in Goldline public relations and legal reps calling me. And 1 year later, Goldline did reach a settlement. They allowed a third party to check that Goldline discloses all price markups to its telephone customers, and they agreed to refund up to $4.5 million to 43 former customers. And as you know, Goldline is a gold seller that has partnered with the likes of Glenn Beck and Mark Levin, etc. And when I called Goldline to just see what the sales process was like, it was truly disturbing. Number one, it was disturbing that they were just so obsessed with Glenn Beck, and the sales rep actually talked to me about how great Glenn Beck is. And I played along. But the most incredible part was my phone call to them was before this settlement, and I made very clear to them I wanted to know what is the price per ounce that I am paying, and they did not tell me, and they would give me talking points as to why I don't need to know that. And this is much of the gold scam, which is it is preached to you as a if the economy falls apart, last resort. But at the same time, you're sold collectible coins, which are sold at a premium relative to what just gold bars would cost. And as we all, if we think about it clearly for a second, can quickly ascertain, if we have one of these scenarios where things have gotten so bad that even currency is no good, we need gold, the collectible value of the coin would disappear. Only the melt value, the weight of the gold would have any value, and thus buying these overpriced collectible coins from places like Goldline makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. If you're going to buy gold, don't buy collectible coins and don't buy from Goldline. That was the lesson 3 years ago, and that is still the lesson that has been reinforced for me over those last 3 years. 2 years ago this week, Wall Street professionals admitted that many of them are corrupt in a study by Populus. This was, of course, no surprise to many of us, and we can surmise that there were probably some or many people in the study who even lied about being corrupt or had a different definition of corruption. So if anything, that study of self-described corruption by Wall Street professionals understated the level of corruption that exists. And money can turn people into monsters, as we know. When money is everything, people make decisions that really don't make sense. And what's interesting is we see this within corporations. If you think about it for a second, when we talk about a corporation being evil, pick whatever corporation often has that association. It could be Walmart, could be Monsanto. When you look at the individuals that make up that corporation, there really aren't that many evil individuals, or even sociopathic or indifferent individuals, or individuals that totally lack empathy. But there's something that's developed in the dynamic of when these corporations get very large and individual people's personal feelings are disconnected from the broader goals of the corporation. And I maintain that it is the corporate structure and corporate culture of many, not all, but many corporations that get too big that really causes problems and leads to immoral behavior. I don't really think that, for the most part, the individuals that are parts of these corporations, that are the decision makers, are evil or not empathetic or indifferent to people's plight at their core. I think that it is the groupthink and the entire corporate culture that leads to these types of actions by corporations that then strike us as just being flat out evil decisions. 1 year ago this week, the U.S. said that charges against Julian Assange will probably never happen. If there were charges, would there be an extradition from the Ecuador embassy where Julian Assange has been? Assange has kind of become a quasi-celebrity. I completely agree that it is unlikely that there will ever be charges. It seems that after all of the WikiLeaks leaks, we now have what I would consider a success when it comes to Julian Assange's goal, which is the content of the WikiLeaks leaks and WikiLeaks itself are discussed more than Julian Assange himself. And this kind of ebbs and flows. We've seen periods when Julian Assange has moved from one place to another, when there were allegations of sexual misconduct against Julian Assange, where Assange himself kind of becomes the lead story and the leaks take a back seat. But I would be open to hearing people who disagree. I think that over the last years, the content of Julian Assange's leaks, and really these are the leaks of the people that work with Assange, that are whistleblowers, not Assange himself, but Assange, of course, facilitates those leaks. The leaks themselves have become more of the subject of the discussion rather than Julian Assange. I am convinced that that's a good thing, because this really shouldn't be about Julian Assange. If we have allegations or evidence that suggests illegal activity by a government or by militaries or by whomever, that really is the important thing. And whether or not Julian Assange sexually assaulted a woman or sexually harassed a woman, etc., whatever you think of those allegations, that doesn't in any way connect to the veracity of the content of the leaks. And that's why it's been very frustrating when we see the discussion go in the direction of just talking about Julian Assange himself. I think that that is a distraction, and it is probably a deliberate distraction from many who want to take away attention from the leaks themselves. Remember that you can support the work we're doing by doing any Amazon shopping that you plan to do after clicking the Amazon banner at davidpakman.com. You go to davidpakman.com, click the Amazon banner, and then just do your shopping. The gift buying season is coming up, a new school semester, and a lot of textbook purchases will be coming up. It won't cost you any more, no forms to fill out, and it sends us a little kickback, and you can support the work we're doing.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Today's classic interview goes back to September of 2010, and it's with William Murray. William Murray was at the time the chairman of the Religious Freedom Coalition. It probably won't surprise you to hear that the Religious Freedom Coalition didn't really seem to be that much about religious freedom, but more about criticizing progressives, Democrats, liberals, and anyone that they believed to be non-Christian, and that happened to include President Obama. And the reason I chose this interview for this week is that we've seen the Obama's a Muslim attacks escalate over the last 6 years. And when we see them change a little bit every day, it can be hard to step back and get perspective over how much they've changed over a longer period of time. And when I went back and listened to this interview with William Murray that we're going to play for you, I noticed that it was quite different from the same types of individuals that are making Obama is a Muslim claims today. Let's see if you agree with me, and then I'll give you my thoughts. And joining us on the phone is William Murray, chairman of the Religious Freedom Coalition in Washington, D.C. You can also get more information at no911mosque.org. Hey, William, thanks for calling in.
Great to be on with you, David.
Hey, so tell me, what exactly is the goal of your organization?
Well, the Religious Freedom Coalition itself works in the United States and overseas, principally in the Middle East. We work on the rights of Christians. We do a tremendous amount of work with the repressed Christians in the Middle East, particularly Iraqi Christian refugees, some with with the church burnings and the massacres in Nigeria, and some in Pakistan. So that's our foreign work. Domestically in the United States, we make an attempt to make sure that the same thing doesn't happen to the rights of Christians in the United States that has happened in a lot of places in the world.
And do you think that there's a imminent risk of Christians losing rights in the U.S.?
Well, I think we can take a look at this 9/11 mosque situation and see problems almost immediately.
Really?
There are, I don't know how many hundreds of churches in the United States that have been refused building permits at one point or another by zoning commissions because many times they're just told flat out, look, you're a nonprofit institution. We need people that are in our town or in our county to pay taxes. You're going to have to move across the line. I know several instances where this has happened in New York State. We also have a situation where you have had a professor just literally fired because he was teaching a course on Catholicism and made the mistake of saying, I actually believe what I'm teaching, and he was fired for hate crimes, basically.
So how is the 9/11? How is what you're calling the 9/11 mosque, which, by the way, I would never call it that. I call it the Lower Manhattan Community Center. How is that representative of Christians losing rights?
Well, I think, first of all, let's get our terms straight. I know it's nice to redefine Ground Zero as only being the Twin Towers, but there were 15 buildings destroyed and more than 20 damaged, including the Marriott, the Hilton. That building that you're talking about that you want to call Lower Manhattan, the landing gear of one of the aircraft went through it. Human remains were removed from it. Now, if you want to say that where part of the airplane crashed isn't Ground Zero, fine with me. But I think the families whose loved ones' remains were in that building would probably consider it part of Ground Zero.
Listen, the real issue to me is not so much whether we call it a Ground Zero mosque or not. I don't happen to think that that's an appropriate name, but be that as it may, there are already mosques closer to where the Twin Towers were than this one, right?
No, that's not true.
Well, I'm looking at a map right in front of me, and I can see very clearly that it is the case. And we've even had guests who have corroborated that, who work right in that area. I mean, I think, regardless, I don't want to get bogged down in that. What is it about?
I know, but it wasn't. We're not talking about a 13-story building where people are going to be discriminated against, where women aren't going to be able to use the swimming pool at the same time as men, where undoubtedly no Jewish person is going to be hired. There's certainly not going to be any pork sandwiches sold. This is a situation in which you have individuals who want to build something, and they have the right to build it no matter how offensive it is to the overwhelming majority of the people of the United States. They have that right. But what we find is many people in the media and the left who are saying those who tell them that it's offensive and shouldn't be built, they should be censored, they should shut up, they don't have a right to speak their mind, they don't have a right to have an opinion. The only one that can have that opinion, of course, is the Muslims and us.
But hold on a second. You're saying that when you turn on, for example, Fox News, you're not seeing just exactly that opinion? That opinion doesn't seem to be suppressed in any way to me.
Well, you don't even want to say that this mosque is a part of Ground Zero. You know, we have to be realistic about this. We can criticize Fox News, of course, and we can also say, hey, look at MSNBC, where you have people just literally scowling at other individuals and screaming at them because they disagree with them.
Should mosques be built anywhere in Manhattan? Or would that be okay with you? I mean, how far would be okay?
There are over 100 mosques in New York City right now.
Well, that's right, and there's ones even closer to ground zero. But new mosques, would it be okay with you to build a new mosque somewhere else on Manhattan Island?
Yes, and it would be nice if it were built by people who would say where the money came from. This is another major problem that I think a lot of us have. $4.8 million cash was paid for that property, and there is no nonprofit corporation, so forget about that. That doesn't exist. They're saying that at some time in the future, and the taxes, by the way, haven't been paid at all. They're delinquent on the building by more than $250,000. But we're told that at some time in the future, a nonprofit organization is going to be built, that at some time in the future, it's going to have a 22-man board of directors, that Imam Rolf has a minor figure that's only going to be one of those 22 people on that board of directors, and that there's no idea who controls it, no concept. This money could have come from the family of Osama bin Laden. It could have come from the Tooth Fairy. Maybe you financed it. Who knows?
Yeah, well, no. You see, now I think we're getting somewhere, William, where we really can agree, because I also have concerns about the funding of this building, and we spoke about this last week with former terrorist Waleed Shabat, and my real concern is that $350,000 was given to the building of this project by the Saudi prince bin Talal, and he has just put in billions into Fox News. And when I hear we've got a guy funding this mosque, and he's also the Fox News, other than Rupert Murdoch, the biggest shareholder, I'm concerned about that. Are you not?
Well, the good sheik didn't get his money. He wanted to have as much influence on Fox as he does on CNN, and apparently that isn't happening.
So you're not particularly concerned by that connection?
Well, it bothers me when somebody that have a predominantly ideological agenda make a major purchase. Yes, it bothers me. I mean, it would bother me if George Soros bought the Dallas Morning News, or if some far right wing guy just totally owned something, and their total purpose was ideological in nature.
Do you believe Barack Obama is anything other than a Christian?
He says he's a Christian,
right?
And in our country, when somebody says there's something, we honor that. I mean, Nancy Pelosi says that she's a Catholic. There are a lot of priests and bishops that will disagree with that statement, but that's what she says. And Barack Obama says he's a Christian. Now, there are people that say, okay, because he believes in collectivist salvation and not personal salvation, he's really not a Christian. That isn't the issue.
No.
The issue is what he says that he is.
And what do you believe? Do you take him at his word? I mean, do you have any evidence to suggest otherwise? I hear some hesitation in your voice.
No, well, I see, as a Christian, I believe in personal salvation. And I believe that he says he's a Christian, of course, but he does believe in the liberation theology concept of collective salvation, that you all get together and you do some great thing, you save society, and then everybody is collectively saved, whether or not they, particularly are Christian or non-Christian or whatever. I don't believe in that concept, but that's not important. He does. And he believes that is a form of Christianity, and he says he is a Christian. And, people that believe he's a Muslim, I understand why the number of people has grown from 9% to 24% that believe he's a Muslim. I understand why that has happened.
Wow.
But
that's incredible. I mean, why? Why has that happened? Why is that logical?
Well, it's a cumulative situation. For instance, he became president of the United States. The first television interview he did was with Arab television, and in which he said the sweetest sound he's ever heard is the evening prayers. And I think that several of those things and the Cairo speech and other things have led people to think that perhaps he has an agenda that is pro-Muslim or might be Muslim. So it's collective. Now, I think part of this is the White House's problem, too, to be very honest with you, and both liberals and conservatives had said this. This isn't me. and that is the fact that there has been very little to challenge this out of the White House. I think in future weeks or months, we're probably going to see Barack Obama and his family headed into a local church. Or
well, hold on a second, William. We've seen Obama in churches for years, and I think the White House is right not to mention it. I mean, Barack Obama has no reason to, it's kind of in the same way that I'm surprised he even commented on the whole birther thing. Hey, listen, I can't go around all the time showing people my birth certificate. It's not really something he has to constantly be doing, proving he's a Christian. I mean, I think it's a pretty extremist movement that is pushing this thing.
No. And I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that I expect the White House to do that. I'm not telling him to do that.
Gotcha.
I say that I believe that because there is this rising number of people that believe that he is a Muslim, that we are going to see a reaction from the White House because of it.
Hey, last question. I always ask all of our guests from Christian organizations about this. I'm Jewish. I don't believe in Jesus. Am I going to hell?
I also run a PAC. It's called Government Is Not God PAC, and we support Jewish candidates. And there are all kind of theories about there are people that are Christian that say, well, you have to have Jesus. There are others that believe in the concept of two covenants, that the Jews have a separate covenant with God.
But what do you believe?
And that Christians have another covenant.
What do you believe, William?
Well, that's just it. That is a theological argument that isn't in my pay grade.
So you don't even want to give me your opinion?
Well, like I said, I am not a theologian. It's not in my pay grade.
All right, you don't even want to give me you don't want to hint at an answer.
Well, it is not an area that I'm expert in, and I have heard both arguments presented to me very, very well by friends of mine that are Jewish and otherwise, and it is an argument that it is a good argument. The concept that God has a separate covenant with the Jews is a very good argument, and I've listened to it, and it is something that with my Jewish friends I don't care to argue.
All right, William Murray, chairman of the Religious Freedom Coalition, no911mosque.org is the website. We don't agree on much, but I'm glad to have spoken to you today. Thanks for calling in.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, take care. So the biggest difference that I saw here in checking out this interview with William Murray is that while the claims being made today are not that different from many of the claims being made by William Murray in this 2010 interview, the tenor and tone has become much more aggressive, much more xenophobic and openly racist, although there were still undertones of that, of course, back in 2010 with people like William Murray. And ad hominems and an anger is much more prevalent within the argument. So I think it's interesting that as President Obama's tenure has gone on, as his first term came and went, and now his second term is more than halfway done, or right around halfway done, actually, we see that the arguments remain similar, amazingly, because of all the data we now have that should easily disprove these. But the tone and tenor has escalated significantly. William Murray, the arguments were insanely xenophobic and not based in fact and so on and so forth. But his demeanor was far less aggressive than many of the birther types that we talked to today. So that's William Murray. That's the classic interview for this week. We will be back after this with your questions. Submit them at davidpakman.com, via Twitter, via Facebook, or by calling our voicemail number, 219-2DAVID-P.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
It is Friday, and it is time for audience questions. We have a Thanksgiving-related question as well. It just seems to be that time of year. We'll get to that last. First question is from Cameron. Cameron says, hey guys, I'm wondering if either of you have ever dated a religious person, and if so, how religious were they, and how did that relationship turn out? I recently dated a religious nut who only believed in biblical sex. And I don't know if that means that you had sex, but it was only a specific type, which was biblical, or by biblical sex, it was no sex until marriage, meaning there was no sex. I don't know. Cameron doesn't specify. Lewis, have you ever dated someone who was really religious?
No. And I think anyone I've dated who claimed to be religious or claimed to be Christian or believe in God really did not follow anything the Bible preached and was for all intents and purposes a-religious.
Yeah, I haven't dated anyone who's religious either. Although, from what I understand, Lewis, an ex-girlfriend of mine ended up, I don't even want to go into detail, but needless to say, was in a relationship, subsequently got into a relationship with a so-called religious nut. And she and her entire family were not religious in any way. And I'm not in touch with this person anymore. I have no idea how this may have worked out. But either she must have just gone along with a lot of extreme religiosity, or there's some way in which drastically different views on religion are working together. But that seems to me like it'd be quite a complex situation.
It sounds, yes, it sounds like a situation I never want to be in. I don't think I would jive with someone who was extremely religious.
Now, if someone said to you, listen, I'm not that religious, but my family is. You go on a date, right? You're on a date, and this young lady says to Lewis, I'm not really religious, but my family is, and I can only be involved in biblical sex. How would you respond to that?
I would probably not respond at all and just walk away. I don't know.
Would you ask questions as to what does it mean, what is biblical sex?
I think I would. That would be my first question. I would just have to say, what do you mean? I'm not sure I understand what you're saying to me. And I think no matter what the answer was, I would probably have to just step away and remove myself from that.
And then give me a sense of, on the scale of religiosity, from completely non-religious to the most devout extreme religiosity, what's the max that you could tolerate for a relationship, do you think?
Oh man, are we doing 1 to 10 here?
Yeah, you don't have to do it. You could just describe it qualitatively. You could say, well, a casual belief that there may well be a God, but no day-to-day prayer and going to services, for example. Or, you could describe it however you want.
Yeah, I think it would have to be someone who either believes there is a creator or might believe that there is, but does not believe in any of the texts that we have available to us.
All right. So there's Lewis's answers. Lewis feeling pretty strongly about that. Yeah, I can't really imagine dating someone who is more than just very low-level religious. Just, even if someone were to say, well, I'm Catholic and I believe in God, but I don't really go to church. My family does, so I go like maybe 3 times a year, something like that. That would probably be the absolute max. And even that might be over time might get to be a little complex. I don't know. So Cameron, there's the answer. I would love to hear more about what your ex that only believed in biblical sex. I would love to know the details of what that's about. We have a voicemail question. You can leave voicemail questions at 219-2-DAVID-P. Let's take a listen.
Hello, David. So I just watched a video of yours about minimum wage and how it should be raised and etc. because it would create jobs, put more money in the lower class, and have money, how it would put more money in the middle class. I just have a question for you. In Singapore, they have no minimum wage at all. There's no minimum wage. And their unemployment rate is 1.9% as of 2013. So how is it that the minimum wage in Singapore is nothing, yet they have an unemployment rate of 1.9%, also with an average GDP of $79,000 versus the U.S. is $53,000. So if raising the minimum wage creates jobs and puts people back to work, how is it that Singapore has some of the lowest unemployment rates in the world?
Yeah. So this question is kind of the Gish Gallop. It's throwing a bunch of stuff at us that's disconnected and not really taking a look at the data that we have in context. So there's a few different issues there, okay? First of all, as far as average GDP in Singapore, Singapore is a tiny country and it's very dense in terms of its population, but this isn't a perfect analogy, but saying why doesn't X that happens in Singapore also happen in the US is like saying, well, why doesn't X that happens in Liechtenstein also happen in the US? We're talking about countries that are on drastically different scales. You have a concentration of wealth that is amazing in some of these countries. And for that reason, just looking at GDP per capita is not going to tell us too much. So then let's go to the first argument, because these are unrelated arguments. And you have to think critically when people bring you stuff like this and say, they gave me all of this stuff. Assuming all the stuff they gave me is true, is it even connected? Is one thing connected to the other? So first, the GDP per capita doesn't tell us that much because it doesn't tell us about inequality. It doesn't tell us about the more common wage. It tells us the mean GDP, but it doesn't tell us the mode GDP. So now let's talk about the employment and the minimum wage part. It's true that Singapore does not have a minimum wage. However, Singapore does have things that we don't have in this country that have a huge impact over wages paid and the need for a minimum wage. For example, Singapore has government stimulus money, government money that goes to companies specifically to bolster wages. So it's money that you only get as an employer if it goes directly to paying your employees more. Now, many in the US, in the absence of a minimum wage, if you tried to institute something like this, people would say, that's not the government's role. This is socialism. This is communism. This is the government getting involved in private industry. It's redistribution of wealth. So if you're just going to say, well, Singapore doesn't have a minimum wage and thus anything, you have to remember, Lewis, that they have money that is an incentive for companies to provide higher wages. And that's something that many of these anti-minimum wage people would never accept.
No, the only thing that people want from business owners want from the government here is tax breaks. And so that, of course, that's something that would never fly.
And secondly, the other difference that we have in Singapore is that the biggest shareholder in a huge portion of companies in Singapore is the government. Okay. And again, that goes completely against, in the US, most of the people that don't want a minimum wage don't want it for reasons that would also see them being incredibly against the government being the majority shareholder of so many of the country's companies. Imagine if the government here owned 30 or 40% of Microsoft and Google and GM, maybe GM is a bad example, and Ford and Tesla, and maybe that's a bad example, so on and so forth. I'm making jokes about some of these companies, but again, Lewis, that's a drastically different scenario in Singapore that has an effect on what companies do and how they treat employees. And then lastly, Singapore still has significant, huge income inequality. So looking at an average, meaning a mean, is different than looking at the median or the mode. And the mean alone doesn't really tell us very much. So I'm going to assume the question was an honest question and the person asking it was simply lacking a lot of the data that's necessary to do a proper analysis. But I don't think that there's much of a comparison to make in terms of the unemployment rate in Singapore because everything about their economy is so different.
Yes, and think about the quality of life of those people in Singapore.
On the low end of that economic spectrum.
Making the lowest wages in Singapore, in those giant factories. I don't think that that's something you want to see in the United States.
Some people actually do. I mean, Michelle Bachmann, I think, does want to see that. She's been on record saying that that's what she would want to see. But no, most people realize that that wouldn't be a good thing for the economy. Last question is a Thanksgiving question. Shannon says, do you either of you celebrate Thanksgiving? Which of the Thanksgiving foods do you like and dislike? Do you care about the Thanksgiving meaning? So I'll go first. I've never really done Thanksgiving growing up because I moved here from another country. When we first moved here, my parents had no idea what Thanksgiving was. As time went on, there really never was a time where we said, okay, we've been here long enough where now we will do Thanksgiving. For us, it was just always mostly a day off. Now I do some Thanksgiving stuff with friends or my girlfriend, etc. But I'm not a big Thanksgiving person. I am highly and acutely aware of the fact that Thanksgiving, while remembered positively for the pilgrims, the early European settlers of this country, Thanksgiving was not a thrilling time for many Native Americans. And I'm very acutely aware of that, Lewis, every Thanksgiving, as I am on Columbus Day when we're celebrating that.
Yes, I am aware of that. I don't like to think about it. It, for me, is just a day where I get to hang out with family, watch football, and eat lots of good food. But I understand that of course there is that connection to it, and I pretty much love all of the food. Growing up in New England, you just a lot of people we grew up with just love all of those traditional Thanksgiving foods. You've got the cranberry sauce, the squash, turkey, stuffing, and I love all of that stuff.
I have to say, I've never really understood some of the Thanksgiving things. Like, turkey is generally quite dry, and I get, you put the gravy on it and it's no longer dry. But I've never really found anything too special about a Thanksgiving turkey, and I've had Thanksgiving turkey that ranges from what people consider to be very good to only mediocre. It's okay. Stuffing, yeah, stuffing's okay. The funniest thing for me was always the cranberry sauce, the gel thing that pops out of a can. I was always, ever since I was a little kid, so confused and just interested in that thing as it slides out of the can. Now, of course, I'm more familiar with the kind of homemade cranberry sauces that aren't just like the can of gelatin. But that canned cranberry sauce is just one of the funniest memories I remember from when I moved to this country and was like, what is that?
Yes, it is. It's still to this day a little bit odd to see it wiggle out of that can and onto a plate or into a bowl.
But lots of the things are good. I love sweet potato pie, and a lot of the pies are great. And then, if you consider that, it needs gravy, the turkey really isn't bad. Although in general, I don't think I'd go in just to start having dry slices of turkey at any other time during the year. What else am I forgetting? What other staples are there? The green beans are good. I know different people have different stuff.
Right. Some people make the green bean casserole. My family has never done that. We usually just make just plain green beans. And I think that's it. I mean, you got your salad, like you said, your pumpkin pie, sweet potato pie, sometimes mashed potatoes, which are fine. Put some gravy on that.
Now,
Lewis, but I will say this.
Yeah.
Hold on. The stuffing should definitely have some apple in it, and maybe some sausage. You gotta kick that stuffing up a notch. Don't just use the normal stuff.
All right. I think definitely no on the sausage, yes on the apple. But reasonable people can disagree about these things, no question about it. So I hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving, and that's it for audience questions. Send in your questions, davidpakman.com, click on Contact Us, leave them via voicemail, 219-2DavidP, or on our Twitter, Facebook, or Reddit pages.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.